150 years after the Civil War, we continue to debate the legacy of the American Civil War. We ask questions about the proper scope of the federal government, we debate issues of nationalism, and perhaps most importantly, we continue to struggle and debate issues surrounding race in American history. Even before the guns fell silent, Americans struggled to come to terms with the legacy of the war. In November of 1863, Lincoln came here to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to dedicate a new cemetery for those soldiers who gave the last full measure so that ultimately the Union would be preserved. But even during the immediate post-war years, the dead on both sides came to dominate how Americans chose to remember their Civil War. In addition to Gettysburg, other cemeteries where Union dead are buried came to symbolize the Union cause, the brave conduct of the men that ultimately left the Union preserved. Confederates also used their dead to commemorate the war and to structure early memory of the war, what came to be known as the Lost Cause. During the early post-war period, white Southerners sort of fashioned their memory of the war around the Confederate dead, but also around broader issues. The war had become a war about states' rights, as opposed to what many white Southerners argued defined the war early on, the issue of slavery. During this period, it really is the veterans on both sides who come to dominate the early memory of the war. Veterans begin to write memoirs and articles for newspapers, and both sides sort of struggled to defend their preferred interpretation of the war. They did so individually, and by the 1880s, they also did so collectively. For federal veterans, veterans of the North, they did so in GAR camps, Grand Army of the Republic camps. In many of these camps, it should be remembered that black veterans joined and were allowed to push for their own preferred interpretation. For black soldiers, veterans, and even for African Americans generally, they continued to push for an interpretation of the war that emphasized emancipation and the hopes of equality in a reconstructed Union. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, American memory was defined both by strong feelings of reunion and reconciliation, but also lingering feelings of bitterness between ex-Confederate and ex-Union soldiers. They came to battlefields like Gettysburg and other places to dedicate new monuments, shake hands here over the bloody angle, but it should never be forgotten that they did not forget about the causes for which they fought, even if they did not discuss them. By the early 20th century, groups like the Sons of Confederate Veterans and other groups throughout the North took up the mantle to promote, again, their preferred memory of the war. For groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, they remained very active through regulating textbooks and other publications to control what the next generation would learn about the American Civil War. By the early 1960s, Americans once again embraced the opportunity to remember their Civil War during the centennial celebrations. Americans did so through reenactments and other events that attracted large crowds. Many of these events tended to steer clear of some of those tough questions related to race and slavery that Americans throughout this period tended to ignore. But that became more and more difficult to do as Americans read in their newspapers and watched on television. They saw images of sit-ins and freedom riders. Our own sesquicentennial is defined by both continuity and change. On the one hand, we continue to remember and even embrace a very traditional view of the Civil War, defined by both the battles and the great leaders. But over the last few decades, Americans have been more willing to talk about some of the more divisive issues, such as race and emancipation. Movies such as Glory, and even more recently movies like Lincoln, have given Americans perhaps increased space to talk amongst themselves about the Civil War in a new light. And the hope, of course, in the end, is that those conversations help to unite us and even come to terms with what many Americans believe is the defining moment in its history.